Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Alex and Andrew for organizing this workshop. So the question that I'll try to address today is how does the topology of brain networks shape and constrain the ability for brain areas to signal each other and to influence each other? At the level of individual neurons, we know that information transfer takes place via electrical impulses. So this information is essentially transferred via axons and synapses. So then the way that individual neurons and neuronal ensembles are arranged and the way that they're interconnected with each other is going to obviously shape the kinds of communication processes that can take place on the network. So what I'll show you today are a series of models, methods, and theories that that look at the kinds of elementary communication processes that can take place on a white matter network. And the idea here is that where the superposition of all of these communication processes ultimately is reflected in the functional connectivity patterns that we observe. So broadly speaking, we can think of communication processes as lying on a continuum. On one extreme, we can think of routing or shortest path communication. So this is a situation where a node in the network, a brain area, has a particular target that it needs to send a signal to, and it uses a dedicated pathway, which is oftentimes either the shortest possible pathway or optimal in some other sense, to do that. On the other extreme, we have the idea of structurally guided diffusion. So here, a signal that emanates from a particular source node essentially randomly goes through the network. The nodes can influence their neighbors, and their neighbors influence their neighbors, and so on. And the signal essentially diffuses along multiple fronts and can activate many different targets. And what I'll show you today is that really this spectrum is one of information. At the level of, at the end where we have diffusion, we're assuming that we're imparting no information on the signal or on the network, and the process can be thought of as random. At the other end, we need to provide a lot of information to the network in order to perform this function. So if you were to make a first guess as to what would be the best way to transfer information in the brain, a really good kind of starting point would be to say, well, you really want to minimize the number of synapses that you have to go through. You want to be able to rapidly perceive changes in the environment. You want to respond to those changes as well. So, and synaptic transmission is going to be slow. So you want to minimize the number of synapses that you're using. Synaptic transmission is likely to be noisy. So again, you don't want the signal to be corrupted as it's going through various synaptic relays. So again, you want to minimize the number of synapses. And finally, the various depolarizations and repolarizations that take place, the synaptic transport itself, all of this requires energy. So minimizing the number of synapses is also an economical solution. And by the way, there is very little that I'll say today that isn't already really nicely covered in this textbook, so I highly recommend it. Now, if we want to formally talk about paths in a network, it's important to distinguish them from walks. A walk is any contiguous set of edges from some source node to some target node. So here you see examples of walks of length 5 and 6. A path, by comparison, or the shortest path, I'll use the terms interchangeably, is the minimum such sequence of edges from source to target. So, and here I just want to point out that paths don't necessarily have to be unique. You could have two different shortest paths that are both of length 4. If we assume that communication is taking place on this network via shortest paths, we can calculate a lot of informative measures and statistics about the role of individual brain areas and also the ability of the network as a whole to process information. So one basic question that we can ask is, if I take my brain area of interest, on average, what is its path length to the rest of the network? How easy is it for that area to send information and to influence the rest of the network? Because if the path length is quite low, if its closeness is quite high, then that area is optimally positioned to exert influence and to broadcast information to the rest of the network. We can also ask, if I take all possible pairs of nodes in my network and I compute the shortest paths between them, what proportion of these shortest paths go through my region of interest? If this particular area sits on many shortest paths in the network, then it's optimally positioned as a way station or as a bridge for signal traffic. It's optimally positioned to receive information from multiple sources and presumably then to integrate information as well. At the level of the whole network, we can also ask what is the mean path length in the network, the so-called characteristic path length. If the mean path length in the network is quite low, that means that on average, any node is easily reachable from any other node in the network. And so the topology of the network is organized in a way that permits efficient transfer of information. And so, in other words, the efficiency of the network is high. And global efficiency, a statistic that appears quite often in the literature, is simply the reciprocal of the characteristic path length. Now, the question then is there any evidence to suggest that maintaining a short path length is in some way a desirable property of the brain? Well, if you think about something like the small world phenomenon, and brains being a hallmark example of a small world network, one of the kind of the cardinal features of a network like that is that it has path lengths that are close to the kind of the theoretical minimum of a random network. So the small world regime is somewhere here, broadly defined, and brain networks have path lengths that are very, very close to being the shortest possible. Another way that you can pose this question is to use what are called minimally rewired networks. So what the authors did here was to take brain networks from the macaque and the entire nervous system of C. elegans, and they created minimally rewired networks by placing all the nodes in their actual original physical location, but then they chose to place edges such that they were minimizing the total wiring cost of the network. And the idea was, could you make a network that requires less material and less energy to maintain? The answer is, yeah, you can actually do a lot better. You can substantially lower the wiring cost of this network, but that comes at an additional cost, for lack of a better word. The path length of these minimally rewired networks is increased. So what that means is that having a short path length is a costly feature of brain networks, but it is a cost that appears to be readily incurred by the network. So there have been many studies, many notable examples of how these measures and statistics can be used as biomarkers, both in healthy individuals and also in clinical populations. I'm just going to show you two to give you an idea of kind of how these sorts of measures can be applied. So here, for instance, the authors looked at the path length from various brain areas to the rest of the brain. And what they showed was that the lower the path length from certain areas to the rest of the brain, so the greater their closeness or the better integrated they were, the higher the IQ of those individuals. And this is an example from a recent study that showed that in healthy neural development, with the emergence of various cognitive capacity, you see an increase in global efficiency of structural networks. So the networks become better organized to process and transmit information. So what I really hope to show you today is that although shortest paths are clearly critical, they can't be the whole story. If you assume shortest path communication, you're assuming that the areas that are sending these signals are aware of, and they know the global topology of the network so that they can actually compute the shortest path with which to communicate. which is a bit of a physiologically implausible assumption to make. In addition, shortest paths constitute only a small fraction of total network density. So what I'm showing you here is a diffusion-weighted adjacency matrix. And here is a matrix with connections that participate in at least one shortest path in the network. So what you can see is that as you go from the original matrix to the shortest path skeleton, you end up going from a density of about 24,000 connections to about 6,000 connections. In other words, if you're saying that communication is taking place only via shortest paths, you're saying that only a quarter of the total network infrastructure is being used, and the rest is just sort of vestigial. So with that in mind, what I want to do is show you a whole host of other measures and theories as to how communication could take place and take advantage of other resources in the network. So when we talk about diffusion, the most common analogy or model is one of a random walker. So you have a person that can go between these various nodes using the structural connections. And the way that they choose where to go is that they just randomly go to any one of the neighbors. They just hop randomly from one node to another. And that's kind of a common model of diffusion. So before I show you how we can compute measures that are analogous to what we can do with shortest paths, I just want to talk a little bit about how easy is it for a diffusion process to actually take advantage of the shortest path infrastructure. So this is the question of search information and path transitivity. What you can see here are two paths, both with length 3. They go from a source node to a target node. The difference between them is that this particular path here has to go through a series of highly connected hubs. So if you imagine a random walker starting in this node, the random walker would have a lot more chances to get lost along the way here. Whereas a random walker that goes from this source node to this target node can easily, just by chance, get to its target. In neurobiological terms, if you are sending a signal from this area, because it's going through a series of other areas with many incoming signals, the potential for the message to get corrupted in some way is greater. So search information is a measure of how much information would you have to give to a random walker in order to keep him on this path. Or in other words, how hidden that shortest path is to a random walker. Path transitivity is a related measure where we're looking at the number of transitive closures along the path. So in other words, how many triangles are there along this path? If there are lots of triangles, that means that the random walker, even if he goes off the shortest path, he can still, just by chance, come back to where he needs to be going. Or in neurobiological terms, the signal still has a good chance of being transmitted to its target with high fidelity. So what the authors did here was to take every possible pair of areas in a structural network and to compute the search information and path transitivity between those areas. And then what they did was to look at the relationship between search information between those areas and path transitivity in those areas and functional connectivity between those areas. So what they found was that the greater the search information between two brain areas, the greater the potential for the signal to get corrupted along the way, the lower the functional connectivity between them. And conversely, the greater the path transitivity between two areas, the greater the potential for the message to get relayed in its original form, the greater the functional connectivity between them. So this suggests then that diffusion might be potentially a meaningful feature mechanism to consider. More broadly, when we talk about diffusion on networks, we can actually consider how diffusion takes place via all possible connections. What we typically do is to convert our matrix, our adjacency matrix of connection weights to what's called a transition probability matrix. So if we think here that we have in the red node a random walker, he's about to choose which of these neighbors he's going to hop to. The probability of going to any one of the neighbors is just the relative connection weight of each of those connections. So for instance, these connection weights sum to 5, so the probability of going via this connection or this connection is 1/5, and the probability of going via this connection is 3/5. So this essentially just represents one row in this matrix, and you can do this for every source node. When you have that, you can compute a lot of measures that are analogous to what we saw with the shortest path framework. So for instance, you can ask, if I start a signal in a particular brain area, how quickly will it arrive at some other target area? In other words, what is the mean first passage time for that random walker to hit that target node? You can ask also, if I'm starting a random walker in a particular brain area, a signal in a particular brain area, how many random walkers or how many signals would I need to ensure that, to within some level of probability, that I ultimately hit a particular target area? In other words, how much do I have to broadcast this signal to ensure that I have complete transmission? You can also ask questions like, if I start two random walkers, so say two signals, like an auditory signal and a visual signal, what is the expected time at which they'll meet along the network? What is the coalescence time for these two random walkers? So this is a really nice example of how these sorts of processes, especially shortest path routing and diffusion, can interact and use different features of the network to operate. So what the authors did here was to grow a series of synthetic networks that optimized either with routing efficiency, so efficiency by shortest path communication, or diffusion efficiency. And when you do that, you end up with what's called a morphospace, so the space of all possible network configurations under these constraints. And what you end up getting are a series of fronts, so frontiers of kind of really what's possible, what sort of configurations are possible, and each one of these fronts is occupied by configurations that have some particular property. So what you can see here in, I think it's front 1, are a series of networks that have modules. They have densely interconnected sets of nodes. These networks are better at routing efficiency than diffusion efficiency. And the reason for that is a random walker easily gets lost or trapped in a community. If you have a cluster of nodes that are all densely interconnected with one another, the random walker will just always be bouncing around from member to member in that community and has very few opportunities to leave the community and to go someplace else. And in fact, this is one of the methods that is used to detect communities in networks. On the other end here, you have a set of nodes that are essentially small world networks with a connected core, or a highly connective core. And for these networks, diffusion efficiency is greater than routing efficiency. The reason for that is that a random walker could easily access a highly connected node, a hub, and from that has access to virtually any other corner of the network. So the question then arises, well, we know that brain networks have both modules and have a connective core. So where do they lie along this spectrum in this space? And what the authors did was to plot the various brain networks in terms of their routing efficiency and diffusion efficiency. And when you do that, you see that they basically all lie along the identity line. So because they have both of these attributes, they are actually about equally good at routing efficiency and diffusion efficiency. In other words, the various properties that they possess make them equally adept at both communication mechanisms and suggest that both could coexist on brain networks. So those were the two extremes, routing and diffusion, but there exists a whole host of measures that are somewhat intermediate between them that have elements of both. So what I'll show you now is the idea of path ensembles. We can go back to the idea of a shortest path and say, okay, now I don't want to consider just one path between two brain areas, between a source and a target. I want to consider the top 2, the top 5, the top 10, 100 paths between them. In other words, I don't want just one channel of communication between my two brain areas. I want to have multiple channels of communication, and I want to ask what is the total bandwidth that I can achieve between these two areas. And that's this K-shortest path framework. By doing that, you can you end up characterizing communication as really taking place via an entire sort of spindle of pathways, and this allows you to consider alternative near-optimal paths, and this communication mechanism is going to be, by definition, more resilient than a shortest path mechanism, because damage to any one of these pathways isn't necessarily going to be fatal for your process. In addition, this is attractive theoretically because it allows you to take into account all edges in the network, essentially. And once you have the k shortest paths between two nodes defined, you can calculate all the same statistics that you had before, like efficiency and betweenness and so on. A notable example of this framework is the so-called communicability. So this is a very popular measure that uses a very specific way to weigh all possible walks between a source and a target. And the way that you do it is you count how many walks you have of length n, and you divide that by n factorial. So in other words, you penalize walks that are longer more than you penalize walks that are shorter. And the reason for using this particular weighing scheme, which might appear at first a little bit arbitrary, is that it has this very nice property where you can actually represent the sum as the exponent of the adjacency matrix. And it turns out that this is actually a very predictive measure of functional interactions. So this is a recent study where the authors used designer receptors and designer drugs to inactivate the amygdala in the macaque. And then they looked at the change in functional connectivity between the amygdala and various other parts of the brain. And what they showed was that the greater the structural communicability between the amygdala and some target area, so in other words, the shorter on average the various walks and communication pathways between these two areas were, the greater the reduction in functional connectivity when you inactivate the amygdala. In other words, communicability appears to be predictive in some sense of the functional interactions between areas. So then just to end, I'll show you one final kind of class of models or measures that revolve around spreading processes. So, and the reason I've kind of put these in the middle is that we can use these sorts of models to parametrically vary the extent to which we rely on either shortest path communication or diffusion. The model that we're using here is what's called a linear threshold model. So it's a very simple model that starts out initially with all nodes in your network being quiescent or off. And in the beginning, you introduce a perturbation, so you turn on one or more nodes. This could be something like the transduction of a sensory stimulus. And the only parameter in the model is a so-called threshold, which simply asks the question, what proportion of my neighbors have to turn on before I also turn on? So if the threshold is 0.4, that means that 40% of your neighbors have to turn on before you turn on. So what happens here, for instance, if we introduce a perturbation, this node has two neighbors, so half of its neighbors have turned on, so it'll also turn on. This node has, again, two neighbors, so half of its neighbors have turned on, so it'll also turn on. But when the cascade gets here, this node has three neighbors. So from its perspective, only a third of its neighbors have turned on, which is less than the threshold of 0.4, so the cascade would stop here. And this is an example of what one of these signaling cascades might look like. So one question that we can ask is, if we were to start a perturbation at every possible node in the network, which projections are being used most often to transmit these information cascades, and also, on average, when are they being used to do this? And what you can see here is that there exists a kind of a compact core of what are very high degree connections, high degree areas, so involving medial prefrontal cortex, precuneus, bilateral insula, and so on, that on average gets used earlier on to spread the cascade. So this is what people have referred to as either the backbone or the core or the rich club, as you'll hear about in the next couple of talks. And this just shows you what the dynamical consequences of having such a structure would be. It's almost the initial substrate that you have to hit and activate if you want to get to any other part of the network. So it's almost like the first bit of the highway that you want to get on before you get to any other peripheral area. We can extend this in a very simple way to include multiple signals or multiple perturbations. So here we're starting two perturbations, but we endow them with different content. And this mimics the situation where you have, say, a visual stimulus and an auditory stimulus or something like that. And what we want to ask here is that as these perturbations develop into signaling cascades, as they start to envelop the brain, they are going to eventually meet and form one or more fronts with one another. And where these fronts are forming is presumably where information is, on average, most likely to be integrated. So one way that we can use to quantify the propensity of a node to sit at the intersection of multiple cascades, so to be a kind of an optimal integrator, is to look at the diversity of its neighborhood. So when the simulation is complete, what is the entropy of this neighborhood vector? In this case, it's the probability of event red plus the probability of event blue. If you do this across many, many seeding scenarios and many simulations, what you find is that there exists a group of areas that essentially belong to the default mode network, dorsal attention network, frontoparietal salience network, that on average tend to be much more likely to occupy intermediate positions between many cascades. So what this tells us then is that a lot of the integrative properties, a lot of the integrative character of these polysensory networks just naturally arises from the way that they're embedded in the global anatomy. They are optimally positioned to get information from many, many different sources. So there are a lot of things that I just didn't have time to mention, but I want to make you aware that there are a lot of theories for alternative conceptualizations of communication. There's an entire field devoted to how one can use heuristics to get through a network and to take advantage of different attributes and the extent to which different types of networks are navigable. Some of you might have recognized this last model that I showed as a special case of a contact percolation, and there's an entire field of physics devoted to these kinds of processes, network flows, and so on. In terms of application, I've talked about mostly communication and signaling, but really these sorts of methods have a lot of application for brain stimulation paradigms, for instance. So if you're using TMS or DBS to stimulate an area, you're not going to just affect that area. You're going to affect the areas that it's connected to and the areas that they're connected to and so on. So the structure of the network is going to condition the effect of the stimulation. So these kinds of models are going to be important in predicting and in optimizing the effects of stimulation. Similarly, with neurodegeneration, there is a lot of evidence now to suggest that a lot of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and so on are the result of transneuronal spreading of misfolded proteins. And that's what you can see here are 5 different neurodegenerative diseases and the various patterns of atrophy in these conditions. And it turns out that, as one would predict, these atrophy patterns look a lot like patterns of functional connectivity, and they look a lot like patterns of anatomical covariance as well. So again, these sorts of measures are going to, I think, have application in predicting the spread of neurodegeneration as well. So then just to summarize, I hope I've convinced you that all network measures imply a specific communication mechanism. Even if you yourself are agnostic about how you think communication takes place on a brain, if you're using a measure, that measure has some kind of assumption. And it's impossible to think of the network just from the perspective of its structure. You always have to think about how that structure interacts with the dynamics that you're considering. Shortest paths are critical, but they might not be the only substrate that is necessary for transmitting information on brain networks. Topological features, the canonical attributes of brain networks like modules, rich clubs, and so on, they are important for, and they are beneficial for some types of communication processes, but not for others. And finally, this whole question of how signaling takes place on brain networks is really a complex, multidimensional trade-off between, on the one hand, how quickly can you transmit information, what is the cost associated with that particular process and with maintaining infrastructure to support that process, what is the versatility of that process and how it can react to changes, and also what is the resilience of that network and that process to damage and other forms of impairment. So please let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that nice overview. Now, one question, maybe a nice setup for the next talk. So what if the brain turns out that, like, for some functional measures you need one kind of efficiency and for others you need another? So let's say, what if you need one for first spikes, but what if you need another one for synchrony?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that's why it's an exciting question to consider. Certainly, you need to be cognizant about the scale at which your network is defined. So whether you're talking about neuronal populations where the unit and the mode of communication is probably synchrony or something like that, it's definitely not spikes. But then if you're working at the level of individual cells, spike trains and things like this are more important to consider. So, and I think that
and how about areas? It is imaginable that they would need something like a first spike to start working, but also synchrony to communicate.
Right.
That's then, then we have like another balance. Then we need a measurement that balances lots of these
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So I think we can benefit a lot by making contact with other fields and other engineered systems here. The way that telephony works, for instance, is via multiplex networks. There are lots of there are lots of processes of various kinds that can take place in via different channels, either via different frequencies or different modes and so on. So I think that as the field gets more complex, as we start to be able to measure networks and functional interactions in using multiple modalities, these kinds of methods are going to become more applicable.
Thank you.
One more question?
So my question is directed for the deep brain stimulation mainly. So it's very nice that you have the spreading process and the perturbation. So what I'm thinking is, what is the background? Like, how can you explain, like, for example, a DBS? So you're basically disrupting the network in a very local or very focal area, and then it's synchronizing to a different oscillation, which we know from the movement disorders, like a beta frequency, for example. How can you explain this?
Explain what? The way that...
Basically,
the
add-on question,
shifting
like,
of synchronization.
Yeah.
I think that that particular model that I showed you is one. I mean, it's one such model. There are lots of other, especially now with this idea of controllability, for instance, and methods like this. Most of these are agnostic as to the temporal process that's taking place. I don't think any of these models are looking specifically at how communication is shifting from one frequency band to another, or how, whether there's synchronization or desynchronization, anything like that. They're just more broadly modeling a perturbation of some kind and how that influences spreading through the network. But there are lots of other ways that you can use to do this. I mean, there's an entire literature on embedding neural mass models, for instance, and individual nodes or chaotic oscillators, and letting them entrain to each other and instantiating synchronous relationships. And then you can introduce perturbations of various kinds in models like that. And again, the effect is going to be mediated by the network, but there are obviously going to be richer dynamics on top. So I think that's also a promising approach.
Thank you.
All right, let's thank Bratislav again.